Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American podcast. And I am very, very excited to have my guest with me today, Diana McCaulay. Diana, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks, Carrie, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I'm very excited to speak with Diana. And we're also going to talk about her lovely book, A House of Miss Pauline, which I will ask her if there a house of Mr. Biss was an inspiration for
No,
it.
no, I wouldn't say that was an inspiration, although I did that book at A level. Um,
Yes,
yeah, and actually loved it. I was so impressed with it, because somebody my age at school we didn't do much Caribbean literature, it was mostly English
I
stuff.
remember.
Yeah, so this was the first time that I can remember us doing a solid, respected Caribbean work.
Yeah.
And it was only after the book had been finished and it had a different title that my publisher thought that it was actually in conversation with the host for Mr. Biswas and suggested the name. So it was called Roots of Stone for most of its life.
Oh, wow. That is very fascinating. As a sidebar, like this story, I feel like if I was going to school back in the day, because I grew up in Mobay, I went to Alvernia. So
Okay.
I did went go through high school and didn't I could count on one hand the Caribbean literature I read. The Jumbie Bird, uh, like very specific books. And I love to see where Caribbean literature is going, and I'm very excited for that. So enough of me. Let's tell the audience a little bit about you, um, more about the work you do, Caribbean country you represent, even though I think they might have a sense of that. But let's start with a little bit about you.
So I am Kingston born, and have lived in Kingston all my life, except for 2 years at school in the US, which happened very late in life. I tell everybody I'm living my life backways, a late bloomer. I'm an Andrews girl. I went to St. Andrew High School, and I've had lots of different jobs. We could spend the hour talking about the various things I've done in my life, but the one probably that is well known for is my environmental work. I was for about 30 years the founder, and then I led the Jamaica Environment Trust for almost 30 years because I grew up really loving the outdoors. I had a dad who took me hiking and swimming and just basically being outside, and I loved going to the beach and up in the mountains and everything. And when I was, I guess, closing on 40, I became aware that a lot of the places I'd loved as a child were disappearing or being destroyed in some way. And I didn't know anything about the environment, but I'm a reader. So I started to read about it. And the more I read, is the more concerned I got. And so I took some pictures of some things I, as a lifelong Kingstonian, had never seen, like the Riverton dump and the sewage plants that didn't work. Invited my friends, and the Jamaica Environment Trust was formed out of those at that time. And eventually, I left my job. I worked for the insurance industry in a pretty good job, really, to be a non-profit person and environmental loudmouth, I used to say. People used to call me. So that's what I did until I retired in 2017. And but in terms of the writing, I declared I was going to be a writer when I was 13, and and have written all my life, and I still have in a trunk behind me, a lot of the handwritten stuff I did as a schoolgirl and teenager, young adult. But my dad, who was a big influence on me, and who was the one who encouraged me to read and to write. But he was a complicated person, and he also said to me that women couldn't write really, and they couldn't write great literature for sure because they didn't do the only thing that was really worthy of great literature, which was go to war. So I kind of believed him, and I wrote in secret for most of my life. So I have a whole pile of books that have never been finished and short stories that have never seen the light of day. But as you start to get on, and as sometimes happened, I had a little health scare, and I thought, if I heard I was dying, the only thing I'd be really annoyed about is I never really tried to publish a book. And so I vowed to do it, and that was Dog Heart, my first book, which came out in 2010. And I was determined. I was just going to send it out. I knew it would be rejected, and I was going to send it out again and again and again and again until finally I'd find a publisher. And so that's how I started writing. And Miss Pauline is now my sixth book. One of those six I self-published because I wanted to see what that journey was like. And the answer was get a publisher. So yeah, that's my story. I'm a Bonia, and have loved Jamaica all my life, and write really to the place. You'll often hear us all, whether we live here or live overseas, you'll hear us say, "I love Jamaica," but sometimes I think we love the idea of Jamaica, but the actual place itself, we don't treat it very well.
I love that you say that, and I want to pull on the environmental string for a little bit. Could it be that we feel like, oh, it's always going to be here, so we don't really take the environment seriously? And do you think environmental impact of Jamaica varies based on whether you live in the interior of the island versus if you live on the coast? And the reason why I ask that, coming from Mobi, I grew up seeing Dead End, which is, how that beach we all love going to, it's just one thing, you really see erosion and what
Mm,
that means and what coming up, or I remember my mom went to Mount Alvernia and she took a picture by the library wall, and you could see there was nothing there, which is now Howard Cook
mhm.
Boulevard, and there was nothing there. And so I think in some ways, because we didn't have a lot of pictures to archive how the landscape that's changed over time, to really be a very stark reminder that no, this land is changing, and if we don't be careful, it go disappear in front of our eyes. And some of that is through our own fault. Like even the way that we build up concrete house now, no breadfruit or nothing in the tree in the yard, everything cut down. So I said enough of my little rant about that. In your time, the Jamaica Environmental Trust, what has been your observation about our relationship to the land and the role we play or don't play in where the land itself, this land of wood and water, this idea that we keep. Jamaica is the land of wood and water, but if we're not careful, there will be only water, no wood. you
And
know,
maybe not even water.
but
It's complicated,
mm-hmm,
Carrie, and that's the thing I can say most. It's somewhat related to occupation. So if you are a yam farmer or you're a fisherman,
mm-hmm,
you may have a greater appreciation of things like the rainy season, that the rainy season is changing. Or if you're a fisherman, you might have a greater appreciation that your fish catches are declining, or places where you used to be able to catch fish, you can't do it anymore. Certainly, if you're a fisherman, you're aware that the beach is eroding. If you're a fisherman, you know that the mangroves play this vital role for healthy fish, and the hotels are destroying the mangroves. So, to a degree, it's related to occupation. It's also related to socioeconomic class, because if you are somebody struggling for survival, you really not have no time to go worry about, whether the atmosphere is all right, or even whether the beach is eroding, right? Because you're very focused on survival. And then there's also something I think in our sort of in our folklore, in our storytelling, where we equate bush with things being backward. So
mm,
we do equate concrete with progress. So a great many Jamaicans will look at Howard Cook Boulevard, and whether they remember what was there before or not, regard it as progress. I think we sort of collectively have in our minds an image of South Florida, that is good, and that is where we would like to go. So I see it differently. I see that Jamaica is I think, a unique place, a very special island with a complicated history. It's a very diverse island. I've traveled around the Caribbean quite a bit, and there are other beautiful islands, but they tend not to be as diverse as Jamaica. And so I think Jamaica is a special place, and it saddens me that we are apparently willing to just get rid of its authenticity, its realness, the thing that is itself, and make it over in this image of this other place. I mean, I think South Florida is fine for South Florida, but why would we want to emulate that? So
Yeah.
that's what saddens me. And then, of course, it's about the health of the natural environment, which we start to appreciate what it was giving us when it's already starts to degrade.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example of that is the coral reefs, which are badly degraded along the north coast, and they are our first line of defense against storms. So we
Yeah.
start to see, greater impact from storms. The same fisherman we were talking about earlier, he has less fish to catch because the fish live on the reef. So by the time we start to appreciate the way it directly affects us, it might be too late.
I agree. So my granduncles, my grandmother's brothers, they're fishermen. So we grew up by the seaside,
Hmm.
White House, over by the airport where the first sandals is. So he would say, "Yeah, man, no fish now come again. The whole of the dirt from the hotel will build up whatever run down." But also, a few years ago, I went to Jamaica for my father's funeral, and I remember my stepfather was like, I was like, "Oh, this water look nice and clean." Him said, "No, sir, this water dirty, man. Rainfall or whatever." And in that moment, I was like, "This water I'm consider dirty." And I realized that I've lived away from the country so long, but what I lost in that progress is able to see the environmental changes that he saw. Like he knew this water wasn't clean because in the last couple days it's been raining. So to him, what looked clear to me comparison to what's beach in New York was not good water, and he was able to look and see. And I thought of how does the new generation, are they able to look at the environment or the surroundings and tell the way that back in the day people could say, well, no, this is something wrong with this, right? We lose some of that in our modernization of the
Yeah,
island, and that could also be why it's very hard to take care of the environment, because as we modernize some of those things that we can use to identify what is not right about the elements or the surroundings, we don't pass that off to the next generation to a certain degree. And I
yeah,
felt that when my stepfather said, "No, man, this water not clean. You're dirty," you know.
yeah.
So
To some degree, it's lost.
yeah,
And I know White House well.
yeah,
We did work with officials in White House over the hotels, right?
yes,
Um, there's a thing in environmental circles called shifting baselines,
mm,
where every generation thinks what it grew up with is the norm, and it's always been like that. And unless somebody tells you, like a grandparent, or as you said earlier, their images, you think that what was around when you were a young person is the norm,
yeah,
and you don't really appreciate the changes that have happened. Now, of
mm,
course, changes happen anyway. I for a while I was quite obsessed with, when Columbus first came to the Caribbean, which is really the first time we have written records of what was seen here. And so we have Columbus's logs of the animals that were in the sea, in the Caribbean Sea at the time, and that has changed so greatly. And that changed, you know, within about 50 years of the European arrival. So things do change, but I think what's happening now is the rate of change is extremely fast,
yeah,
and it's happening way too quickly without enough consideration about, well, hold on a little bit. If we take out this stretch of mangroves, what's that going to mean for the stability of the beach? And then when the beach goes, you hear, oh, well, we have to dredge sand, and that
mm-hmm,
means taking it out of the sea, and that means it has impacts in the sea. So
mm-hmm.
it's like this snowballing set of problems. And I think young people now, I'm going to sound like a real old person, because this is what old people always say
What we
about young
say?
people. This is nothing new, but they're not really so concerned about these kind of issues. They're more concerned about material things, and I think that's a change I've seen in my life. More about flashy cars and the latest iPhone and whatever.
Mm-hmm,
Although I will say that when I was with the environmental group, I worked with some really great young people, and they were very concerned about what we were doing to their home place. But I would say they're not as many of them as I would like, and the changes that need to happen at the young level, because this really is a problem for young people. I won't
people,
be around.
yeah,
Um, it hasn't happened as as in as wide a scope and or as quickly as I'd hoped.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We could always go on about the environment, but
We could.
I want to shift to Miss Pauline, which thank you. This was such a delightful read. I will share at the end my notes on how I connect to it personally, but I wanted to ask how much of the environment did you factor in the story about Miss Pauline before that? If you can give the audience a little gist, because me, we spoil it for them, get them the whole thing. So
Okay.
if you could, give a little synopsis about A House of Miss Pauline.
So it's Miss Pauline is a woman, a rural woman. She's lived all her life in rural St. Mary, and she's had a difficult life, and she's approaching her 100th birthday. And she's taken the stones of a nearby plantation ruin, so an old slave house that was lost in the forest, which she finds by accident. And she's taken those stones to build her own house after her own house was destroyed in a hurricane because she wants something safe where she and her family can live. And just as she's approaching her 100th birthday, the stones of her house start to shift in the night and make these noises and eventually start to speak. And she knows at that point that there are atonements she has to make in her own life. And she sets out to do that by enlisting the help of a granddaughter who lives in the US, and to try and make these reparations, these atonements that she knows she wants to make before she dies. So it's basically about her journey to do that, and the secret that she has kept for most of her life. You ask about the environment in the book, her real connection to this place where she has spent her entire life, how she feels about it, what it looks like, um, her love for where she spent her life, and her wish to make sure she sets things right before she dies.
I love that summary. I would agree with the whole thing. Um, But what I do enjoy about reading Caribbean literature, as I said at the top of the episode, is being able to connect with the location or the place where the story is set. First and foremost, that's always for me. It's one thing to read a book that's set in Jamaica. It's one thing to have a connection to the place. And for me, that's always rare because most stories they tend to set it in Kingston. So anything that's set in Mobe, where I'm from, and in this case, while I'm not from St. Mary, my maternal grandfather is from St. Mary. I spent a lot of summers in Highgate.
Oh,
And so when I read it and I was like, oh yeah, St. Mary, that's nice. The only thing missing was the whole heap of banana walk conversations, but it was so good to connect, with the scene and how they described it at a point. Even the hurricane that you mentioned here, I would visit St. Mary before that hurricane, and I remember the difference. But yeah, that old Diana. Uh,
I wasn't going to say anything.
if it's the 88 one, absolutely. I remember going to St. Mary 87, 86, and then going back the year after, and just like how the landscape in my grand aunt's property had changed because of the hurricane. And so hearing Miss Pauline tell the story was was so moving for me because as I was telling my friend's mom, I was still a child, I was around, maybe I can't remember the age at this point, but I was still a child, but not understanding the grasp that my parents have to deal with, the shortage of food, like shortage of food, me never hungry. And I guess I didn't appreciate all the work that she had to do to make sure I didn't feel hungry. To me, it was, oh, it's fun, breeze blow down everything, so it is fun
Yeah.
time, versus, hearing or reading all that she had to do to ensure the survival of herself and our family. So I really appreciated that telling. And I also appreciated hearing a story from another part of Jamaica that's not always included in literature, right? Like a parish like St. Mary. I mean, we might hear about St. Mary, but people may not realize it's St. Mary in the other books about James Bond and all these things. So I really appreciated that you went to a parish like St. Mary that is absolutely beautiful, especially when you drive down to Port Maria. But anyway, just to tell that. So I just wanted to say that I connected. And after this recording, I'll tell you all the other stuff because I'm gonna give away the book if I tell the other things that I
Okay.
appreciate. So when you came up with the character of Miss Pauline, what was the inspiration for it? For her character?
So books have a long gestation, or certainly for
Mhm.
me anyway. And I would say Miss Pauline was a long time coming.
Mhm.
But in no particular order, I had a great aunt who was born in 1896 and she lived until she was 102. And I knew her well. Um, and I used to think about the changes she had seen in her whole life. So as a young woman, so one side of my family is from Black River. So as a young woman, she came to Kingston in a buggy. And I
Mhm.
used to think about her being in the buggy at the bottom of Spurtree Hill, which she
Mhm.
would have called Man Bump, and how that journey might have taken her 2 or 3 days. And she would have been staying in, little roadside taverns or whatever at the time. And then towards the end of her life, I sat with her and showed her how to use a computer. And she'd flown on an airplane, the whole communication revolution with cell phones and all of that. Remember, we had to get her a cell phone with a huge dial because she couldn't really see to use a
Mhm.
small phone. So I used to think about the changes that she had lived in her life, and so
Mhm.
that my experience with her was kind of teasing me in my mind. And so that was one piece. Another piece, so I'm a little obsessed with the plantation great houses because, as I explained in an author's note at the back of the book, this story is partly about my own ancestry, which I only discovered relatively recently. I had a family story that my family came to Jamaica because my great grandfather was a Baptist missionary, he was Scottish, and this was my background. And I used to, people look at me and say, slave owner. And I used to, almost before the words were out of their mouth, but you're not Jamaican, are you? I would be telling them, oh, my great grandfather was a Baptist missionary, right? Leave me
Mhm.
alone, kind of thing. So relatively recent, I found out about this other aspect of my family on my mother's side, where indeed there were slave owners in my ancestry. So I've always been, even before I knew that, I've been somewhat uncomfortable and uncertain about what should be done with the plantation great houses because some of them are in the most, well, most of them actually are in the most beautiful places you can imagine. So it was hard for me to stand there and think they should be burnt to the ground. We should get rid of them. They speak of an atrocity, a terrible crime. They should be gone. It was hard for me to stand there. Anyway, I have a friend who knew of my writing aspirations and invited me to a writing workshop at a great house. And I was in a little tiny room that was under the front stairs of the great house. And sleeping there, I, I felt like this room had belonged to a woman, and a woman who was probably some kind of enslaved woman who looked after the people in the house because she was there to be close to them. And she took root in my mind.
Mhm.
So I had this older relative and then this imaginary woman who I felt had visited me, if you like, or began to speak to me, although not in an audible way, from my experience at this great house. And then years passed, and during my environmental work, a friend took me to see a ruin in Cockpit Country where I was doing my environmental work because it was built over a sinkhole. And that's what interested him. And I thought, built over a sinkhole? That is so weird. Why would anybody do that? And what did
Mhm.
they do? Did they drink the water or did they use it as a toilet? And he took me to this place and it was fallen down. And yes, indeed, it was built over the sinkhole. And that stuck in my brain. And then the final thing was I was out for dinner one night and I heard a story of a foreigner, a man from overseas, who had come to the same ruin that was really a ruin. It was by then just stones scattered around the landscape, and had taken the stones of the great house to build his own house.
Mhm.
And I started thinking, well, why a white man?
Mhm.
Why not a black woman? A
Mhm.
black rural woman from that area? And why is that not a kind of reparations, a kind of restoring what was really hers. And that's a long story about about the inspiration for a house for Miss Pauline. But I will also say to you and your listeners that I started writing this book in the pandemic as entertainment, as lockdown, it was during lockdown, I should say, and as entertainment for myself, because by then, at book number 5, I was kind of done with publication. I had written all my life, and I was going to do it just for me. And I really sat at my computer and started writing what was then Roots of Stone, now A House for Miss Pauline, to entertain myself. And I called it my long strip of knitting. So that's another name it had. Because I wasn't bothered with plot. I wasn't bothered with anything. I was just going to have fun with this character and let her onto the page. She was in my mind. She'd been in my mind for so long. Here you go. Let me see what you do. And so the book was my long strip of knitting, and I really wasn't going to send it anywhere. And then a friend, Justine Hensel, who is one of the producers of Calabash, the Calabash Literary Festival in Treasure Beach, sent me this opportunity for writers over 50. By then I was well over 50. I thought, oh, well, it's just a little 5,000 words. Nothing will happen. Here we are. It won that competition. And through that, I found an agent and a publisher, and the book's about to come out.
Thank you for that. I think that is such a fascinating story. And even this idea of the plantations and what to do with it, I think now in the age that we live in, I've seen a lot of commentaries about people having weddings at, former great houses, and they shouldn't do that because they're dancing on the graves of, all of that. It could be very contentious. But from your view and from Miss Pauline's view, Miss Pauline says, "What is my right, basically, to do this?" And I'm still kind of processing because I think it's easy to say that when you're at such a distance from these structures, right? Like you
Right.
you don't interact with them, growing up in Mobay, every school trip, where we going? Annie Palmer, Rose Hall,
Rosa.
you know, and it was just something that you did, not thinking of, the slavery and what that is. And I feel like at some point there are different narratives we can see. It's not, yes, there were some atrocities and all these other things on there, but if this is the only view that we have of it, then we may be missing up. I think we're missing a point of that story as well, right? There, the tenacity and the survival and what happens to the slaves that were on that plantation, especially, and this is all coming from my book of, the White Witch of Rose Hall and how everything happened, right? But I also think it's important in the retelling of the stories of these structures that and what they represent. And I found myself saying, I don't see why Miss Pauline was wrong, or anybody in Mason Hall was wrong for that point, because it was there and they should take it. But what would you say to anyone, or what's your opinion, or what would you say to anyone who's still having conflicted feelings about these structures and how they should view them as parts of our society? Or should they remain as reminders? Should they be glorified as these fancy places to go visit? What are your thoughts on on these
So I'm
buildings?
conflicted too,
Yeah.
actually, and I say in the author's note at the end that I don't really have an answer to those questions. I think we should talk about it though,
Yeah.
and I don't stand in a place where they should be destroyed.
Mhm.
I also don't stand in a place where there should be weddings either,
Mhm.
or a mento band and a drink with an umbrella in it. Is not that kind of place either.
Mhm.
Although I will say, my friend who invited me to that writers' workshop, she points out, that that particular great house provides employment for a rural community with few opportunities for employment. So it is a complicated question.
Mhm.
I would like to see them, I guess, as more as memorials. And if we are going to use them in any kind of celebratory way, such as like a wedding, that there absolutely must be some part of the whole grounds and the whole house experience that really pays tribute to the people who died there, who
Mhm.
labored and died there. I mean, our history, Carrie Ann, is complicated, and I don't think we should shy away from that. And it
Absolutely
is
not.
tragic. I don't want to see it expunged, you know. I don't want to see it to not exist at all. So you know, there's, for instance, there's Vale Royal, which is near where I live in Kingston, that's falling down, and I am sorry to see that. You know, I'm sorry to see the old buildings from the Hope plantation up at Hope Zoo that are falling down, because I would like to see them used. I would like to see them used in a way that benefits current generations, that recognizes what happened there. If they can provide employment to people, great. If we can, while we understand the atrocities that happened, if we can also celebrate the beauty of the places, if we can celebrate the craftsmanship and the skill of the people who built it. Remember, it was no white people that built it,
Yeah, that I know. I
you know.
and I think that's where I was going. Like, in addition to the tenacity, that's what I meant. Like, the skill it took to build. Because I've been to Rose Hall so many times, right? Or even it could be a source of education, and I think that's what gets lost when we villainize the property, right? I learned so much. It's one thing to read something in a book, but having walked through it and seeing it for yourself and having a lay of the land. I think it's very important. They're as close to museums as we can get. And I think they create an opportunity for learning that maybe we discount because they don't look like, again, going back to our earlier conversation about environmentalism, they don't look like um, the global north's version of what is a museum. This is a slave master house, and it should be condemned. It's part of our history, and it's an opportunity to teach the next generation. Especially, my view is, as more people migrate from the region, or their kids, so my kids, they've never been there. It would be an
Mm.
opportunity for them to go there and learn in a different way. And kids learn differently. They may not read it in a book, but you have them experience a space and tell a story in that way, they will remember. So I think that's how I see them, as a place of learning, a place of remembering. This is where we have come from. We don't want to go back there. So how we
Yeah.
learn from these things. So
So maybe that's a good way to put it, actually, that we can villainize the events that
mhm,
took place without villainizing that place itself.
yeah.
Maybe that's a good way to look at it, you know, and that there is an aspect of it for celebrating the craftsmanship, the resilience, the determination, the survival, without celebrating the events that took place. There's a way for this to be a memorial. You know, there's a place on the North Coast, I don't know if you ever went to it, called Seville Great House, which is interesting because it has both Taino, Spanish, English settlements there. And what they've done there is the sort of English Great House is a museum. So it has the artifacts that were found. There's a space that is an African graves that are memorialized, and then they have built a Taino, a recreation of a Taino village, because you know the Tainos didn't use stone; they used mud and so
Wood.
forth, so they didn't
Mhm.
survive. And I always thought that was a good way of doing it. So you know, it memorializes the place without, as I say, you're having a mental band and that kind of thing. So something like that, I always thought was a good way to make sure these places just don't fall into ruin.
Yeah. One of the other themes that I think is also very important in the story, A House of Miss Pauline, is what we've lost in intergenerational relationships.
Mm.
And, um,
You're a
you know,
good reader.
thank you. Well, my husband and I, we joke all the time that we did always hang out with the old people, them. So we understood their language, and we liked the relationship with them because they were cool people. There was just something that we learned and we observed and we enjoyed. And as we're older, we saw the benefit of I was my grandmother handbag. I go everywhere with my grandmother. Every pan knocker church, clearly, that's where I was. I was in more pictures with my grandmother than I was with my mom. But I learned so much from her and her church sisters. And the relationship that I have with my grandmother, I love my mom, but my relationship with my grandmother is she's the son, and I
Mm.
value that so much. And so, when the elders are around, I know which joke to tell, I know which tune to pull, I know whatever it was to make them happy, and they would tell a story, and you want to hear the stories. And I think that's was Miss Pauline. I would love Miss Pauline because I know Miss Pauline have some good story to tell. I just
Yeah.
have to get her on a good day and just sit down and talk to Miss Pauline. But my experience growing up with all of the elders isn't what everyone else's experience is. And we lose so much of our history and culture because there's not that relationship or connection anymore. And that is accelerated when kids go off foreign and leave the grandparents behind. And so for me, the story with Lamont, Poppy, you know, and even the granddaughter were things that I liked because I felt like they were in Miss Pauline arm's length, don't get close to Miss Pauline in her own way. She was showing her care, but and I think maybe that's the impatience of being a youth. You can't see that she might come off miserable, but she really cares in her own way. It just looked and show up differently. And that's what I really loved about the story with Miss Pauline. So when we talk about intergenerational relationships, what what were you trying to pull out there, and what's the lesson for the rest of us? Because I think this book was like, this is a walk-in lesson of we need to do a bunch of things. So what was the lesson or the takeaway you want the audience to get from the time we have left with the elders we have here, whoever they are in your family, and what should we be doing with them and
Yeah.
culturally?
So I had my father's mother was a big influence in my life as well. So I had a grandmother like yours, and she was
Hmm.
a very strong woman and she influenced me greatly. And I think that's quite a feature of Jamaican life. A lot of us are really raised by our grandmothers, and if not directly raised, they're strong influences. And in literature, you rarely find an older woman as a protagonist, as a hero.
Hmm.
So I wanted to do that. As I
Hmm.
get up in years, I wanted to push back against this idea that, oh gosh, you're an older woman, you're invisible, you don't have a contribution to make anymore, just go sit at your house and do some knitting, which I was pretending to do when I was writing the book. So that was one thing. I wanted to give some space for an older protagonist. And I wanted her to be different. I wanted her to be a really atypical Jamaican woman and not in any way some kind of stereotype, about what kind of woman she was. I wanted her to be strong. I wanted her to overcome these many odds. I wanted her to be colorful. I mean, truthfully, it sounds like I went into this with a plan. And that really is not what happened. It was more that she revealed herself to me as I sat down and let her. And I
Yeah.
know that sounds crazy, but it's really my experience of how these things happen. I don't actually usually start with a place in my books. I start with a person. And all of my main characters have come to me in strange ways, in dreams, in just somehow, like you're staying in this place and this woman moves into your head and they start to reveal themselves to me. And mostly they have not had my life. These
Hmm.
are people that I have not lived their lives. I know that. But I trust them. I trust what they're telling me is the truth. And I hope that comes out in the pages, that I'm doing justice to their lives. And
Hmm.
that's not to say I didn't read quite a bit about Jamaica, rural Jamaica, at the time, because I grew up in Kingston
Yeah.
and, I didn't have that kind of life. So I did read, books about fiction about what
Yeah.
things are like there, and hopefully, some of those details are correct.
Yeah.
So, as to what to do with our elders, I think we're losing some our stories, and
Absolutely.
these people have these amazing stories to tell. No, I know I'm getting like this myself. When you're talking to old people, they repeat themselves, and Lord, me don't hear that story about 25 times about the time you went to the market and you forgot to bring back the change, and to a degree, young people get a bit impatient with that. But I think the richness of those stories is really something that we should not lose. And I try to do it in the way that I do things in books. But there are other ways, oral histories, film, what you're doing here with this interview. I think that's really, really important because they have such rich stories. And these days, we need a lot of different ways to tell those stories. It can't always be the written word. It has to
Yeah.
be many, many different things. And so I hope that Miss Pauline will spark some interest in that, in talking to old people, especially old women, and learning about how they actually raised families in these, very, very difficult circumstances, and how, in fact, they will often tell you, that they had a happy life
Listen.
despite what you look at from the outside and say, oh my gosh, you didn't have any running water and you didn't have an inside bathroom, they are going to tell you how it was great.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we regard ourselves as modern Jamaicans need to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask about the research because, there were so many specific things, particularly with Clive, the building of the roads and all these other things that I was like, how much research did you do? But you kind of said you tried to get as specific as possible with how rural living is. Even growing up, like visiting St. Mary, I understand, like, going into Highgate and, it was, to me, it felt like, oh yeah, I know what she's talking about. Like my grandfather's brother, he also lived in Islington. So, oh, we're gonna go up at Uncle Sonny Farm, and it was just a whole trek. So it was, to me, it felt real, as realistic as I could remember as a 9 year old going to St. Mary and visiting. Um, the other thing that I loved about the story was, and I think it still happens in rural Jamaica, the juxtaposition with old and new. Like the post office, the local PA is still there, but we have internet, right? It was, I said, of course this makes sense. Somebody still go and send a letter, even though, nobody really does that anymore. And I think that's, for me, going back to Jamaica, it's always these modern and things that represent the past that still coexist in a way. And maybe because people are in the space, they don't think of it. But me returning as a visitor to home, I see it more clearly and they remind me of a time that no longer exists. So I don't know how much thought you put into like making those specifics to the story about a library, where even here in America, who go to the library anymore,
Mm.
with the internet. So I wanted to know if that was like intentional of having the library and the post office against all these modern amenities, even in
Yeah.
a rural place.
So I think, if you want to write successfully, you've got to start to look. You have to
Hmm.
observe, right? So, and if you pay attention to what's around you, then the next step is you ask yourself, what does it mean? So, and I've really observed life here in lots of different ways. I mean, my first book was set in Kingston, again, a life I did not live. Um, so you look first, and then you think, what does it mean? And to me,
Hmm.
this sort of coexistence of what was with what is, and also what is coming but not yet here, is is good. It's a valuable thing. That's why I don't want the old things to be pulled down and forgotten, right? And I have a thing that I say that Jamaica is a place, a country that is both dying and being born at the same
Hmm.
time. So I think all around us we see that. We see buildings that are falling down, we see new buildings. We see billboards that are moving because of, some really complicated technology, and right next to it a stoplight that's not working and hasn't worked for 3 weeks. We see markets that, I mean, markets have been such a feature of our life going way back into history, but many of our markets, the roof has fallen off and it's a tarpaulin, and then it's right next to this really shiny office building. You go down into downtown Kingston and that's what you'll see. You'll go to the fishing beach at White House, which still is still there, and right next door to it is an all-inclusive hotel.
Hotel.
You know, so I think there's this conflict that is, and I don't even know if I want to say it's a conflict, that this commentary on a country that is moving from one state into another state that is just ever present for me.
Mm,
And that's what I gravitate to describing.
mm,
And like I say, I think it's a valuable thing. I think it's, a city that I love, London, where my son lives. I think that's one of the things they've done so well, because all over London there are these old buildings, and they're all in beautiful repair, and it's got a little plaque outside saying some man lived there, and next to it now is some skyscraper that look like a pickle, and it's just the latest in everything. And I like that. I think it's interesting. It's varied. It asks questions of you. So, and I see some of that here, and I want to keep it.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanna I wanna keep the library. I'd like them to fix the traffic lights as well, but I want to keep the library.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel the same way. Whenever I go back to Jamaica, I want to go to Sangsters and buy books because I can only get books there and I don't want to buy them online. I want to go to, certain bakeries. It's because they connect me to memories. My grandmother is no longer
Um,
here. So, they are part of memories. You see them and, I can't explain it. It's like it's just tangible memories. You touch it, where this is. Even Crick Street, if I pass by and when I was growing up, they say, oh, River Mama under the dome and all these things, right? Like, I don't
which
care.
definitely she's under the dome. Okay, I just want to say
Right? So,
that.
the idea of going up the steep steps, through Barracks Road to infant school, like those are important aspects of memory. And memory in that way, they trigger stories. And for me, I love the storytelling that the old folks do. I absolutely love it. So on that note, what is your final takeaway for anyone who's thinking of reading it, but they're not sure, even though me think them if you read it because they're gonna like Miss Pauline. But any last words for the audience before we go to the after show where I can ask you all my wonderful questions?
Oh man, they must read it. They
Yes.
must read it. I mean, I find this part of book writing hard, where you've got to go up to people and tell them to buy a book, right? And how it's wonderful and the best. I'm not very good at it,
Yeah.
but I think of all, and like I say, this is my sixth book. I loved Miss Pauline. I loved spending time with her. I wanted to see what she was going to do. I loved her feistiness, her directness, her strength, but also her kindness,
Mm-hmm.
and the way she would take no nonsense. She was such a role model for me, right? I want to be
Yeah.
that kind of old person.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm given that length of time, I think my book is as all of my books have been, a tribute to Jamaica. A
Yeah.
sort of putting into words how I feel about it, what a special place it is. Yes, of course, difficult. It's difficult. And yes, it has a difficult history, but it's also unique and interesting and fascinating. And yeah, I hope you love it. Read it,
Yeah.
man. It's good.
Yeah, it's good. And for me, I think Miss Pauline is, like I said, an amalgamation of plenty Jamaican women. You can see aspects of them in Miss Pauline, and and those women don't get to go in the history book. And I think Miss
Oh,
Pauline is a good way to kind of pay homage to these strong matriarchs that exist in most of our lives in Jamaica. So I love it. Go read A House of Miss Pauline, please and thanks. And so on that note, until next time, walk good. But guess what? Me and Diana is going into the after show. We're going to labrish a little bit. So make sure, say, you come into the community and hear what we're laughing about. All right?